Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us here. It's great to be here celebrating Multicultural Month in Queensland. Check out the Multicultural Affairs website. There's so many good information that is on the website and many events that you'll find interesting throughout the month. Shall we begin?
Yep, let's go.
Fantastic. So first, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Aboriginal peoples and the Torres Strait Islanders peoples as the First Nations peoples of the country on which this event is taking place. I recognize their enduring connection to land, water, sky, country, and community. I pay my respects to them, their cultures, and to their elders, past and present. So today, what we'll be talking about is best practices when working with interpreters. Hello, my name is Karen, and here with me is Lou.
Hello, I'm Louise.
And today we'll be sharing tips. We'll be sharing some stories. We'll have some data to share with you, as well as some short clips and acting real sessions where an interpreter is present within a doctor and with the patient. So today, the webcast is being recorded, and in the unlikely event of a technical issue, this session will be available to view later today using the same link that you logged in here. Before we get started, I'd like to point out the interactive features of the webcast player that you are watching right now. If you move your mouse over the screen, in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see 3 small dots. And if you hover your mouse over there, these dots, you'll see some options. So we welcome questions to be asked of us. And so click on a question, ask a question, and you can send through your questions or comments by filling out the form and then click to send. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation, but really feel free to chat in your questions or put them in there because we'll be monitoring those questions. I encourage you to provide your name, your email address, along with the question or comment that you may have. And if we don't get to it during the webcast here today, then we'll be certain to follow up with you afterwards. If you are having any technical difficulties, first try to refresh your browser. And if that doesn't work, then you can click on info. There's an info click there, and you'll be connected to live chat support. All righty, well, welcome again. My name is Karen Hodgson, and I'm the CEO of Translationz. I've been working in the language service space for over 20 years. I'm originally from the US, and I have great passion for finding solutions for called communities that require access to fundamental services and programs.
And hello, my name's Louise. I'm part of the client services team here at Translationz. I'm from Wales, UK originally, and I studied translation in university. I've got a languages background. I've been working in language services for about 4 years now. And here at Translationz, I work with both clients and interpreters, so I get to see both sides of things. And yeah, we're looking forward to sharing what we know with you today.
Yep. All right, so just a little bit about Translationz. So we've been around for 20 years. Translationz has been providing language services. We provide interpreting and translation and many related language services. We provide interpreting in over 180 different languages. We are also an approved provider on the whole of Queensland government for language services. We provide migrant languages as well as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages and Auslan. We have over 35,000 interpreters that work with us in Queensland, but all across the country as well. We do a lot of work in the translation space as well. We could translate into 250 plus languages. We do a lot of flyer translations, brochure, websites, and a whole lot of other things as well. We also do related services such as audiovisual production, subtitling, transcription, AI solutions is big in our space and big in so many other industries, and we are staying on top of the developments with AI, and we have a lot of things going on the back end as well. In order to service the amount of volume of interpreters on a daily basis that we service and all the translation work we do, we have award-winning technology that helps us schedule interpreters, making sure that they're going on those assignments on time, and just that the overall efficiency is happening. And we are super proud to be ISO certified in translation, in interpreting, and cybersecurity. So what that means is that we must follow certain standards and procedures and processes. And what that leads to is a higher level of accuracy and overall higher level of client satisfaction. And also we work with many organizations, government organizations, the transport, the courts, migration firms, education, the police, various NGOs and settlements, and a whole lot more. All right, so here's a little bit of data. Australia is a multicultural and multilingual country. In 2022, more than 7.7 million people living in it, and that represents about 30% of the population. More than 400 languages are spoken in Australia today, and the top 5 countries that emigrated into Australia in most recent times include India, China, the Philippines, Nepal, and UK. And if we look at those countries, we can see that the cultural differences amongst those countries vary quite differently. So someone accessing in India, healthcare is quite different than someone in China, and the legal system is very different among all these countries. So by appreciating and respecting different cultures, we all play a role in helping make Australia a more welcoming and vibrant country for all. Being culturally aware not only brings people together, but it also enriches our everyday lives. Interpreters play a vital role in helping us understand various cultures, and we'll talk about that a little bit more soon. So I'd like to start off with a case study by the name of someone whose name was Willie Ramirez. So Willie was an 18-year-old athlete. He played basketball, and he arrived at the ER department, and he was unconscious. He came there with his family members, and his family members predominantly spoke Spanish. The ER physician that was attending Willie spoke English, and no interpreter was present during this whole process. The ER physician assumed that Willie had taken a drug. He was experiencing a drug overdose. And it didn't help when the Spanish-speaking family members also said that Willie was, in Spanish, he said, intoxicado. This word intoxicado could mean intoxicated, or it could also mean poisoned. So the ER physician, he assumed that Willie was intoxicated and treated him as such. So what occurred, the medical treatment that he was getting over the next 2 days wasn't sufficient to his food poisoning that actually he had. And what happened to Willie is that he suffered a brain hemorrhage, and as a result, had left him a paraplegic. So what we see from this awful example, an interpreter was not present to help guide the situation in order to convey the important information that the family members were providing to the ER person. And it resulted in inaccurate diagnosis of Willie's condition and resulted in an awful, awful result. So this is definitely a sad story. We'd like to now share with you some really positive short stories that we reached out to our interpreters who bombarded us with many beautiful stories that we'd like to share. we only have an hour here, so we'll have to just cut it down to 2. So next, if you'd like to share those stories.
Thank you, Karen. So yeah, we've got some more uplifting stories now, something a little bit more positive. And these are actually real life situations that 2 of our interpreters have shared with us, and shows the kind of impact they make in their career as interpreters. So we spoke with Van, one of our interpreters. She works a lot with elderly patients and patients who undergo what is called the RUDAS assessment. Some of you may be familiar with. It's where they test for dementia. And Rosanne explained to us that this is often a very stressful situation for the elderly patients. She can see their stress when they're in the room, and she adopts this sort of gentle, affectionate voice. She said it helps them to feel calm, and if they feel calm as a result, then they can answer the questions that they're being asked better than they would if they were feeling stressed. She left us with this quote that one of the sons of her patient said. He said, "We're so lucky today. My mum's usually distracted and forgets many things, but today she answered the questions so well. I think today is a unique day." And I think that really reminded Rosanne the kind of why she's there, what her impact is. Perhaps if she hadn't been there, it could have been a different outcome. So that was a nice one. And then a very different one that we had from our interpreter, Lynn. Is Mandarin speaker. She interprets for lots of legal situations. She's very high experienced. She was working on a case where a mum was being investigated for a child abuse allegation. Obviously a very tricky subject. The backstory of this was that the mum was using this traditional herbal remedy to try and help her daughter who had intestinal worms. The mum believed she was doing the right thing. It was this this traditional herbal remedy that was traditional to her culture, but her daughter was beginning to vomit, and she thought this was part of the process, so she continued. Little did she know that she was having a bad effect on her daughter. She didn't intend on this. Unfortunately, the brother became concerned, called the police. The police got involved. Lynn's job in this case was to just obviously interpret for the mum who spoke Mandarin, and she was able to flag this cultural issue. She said, "Look, there's something more going on here. We need to get a cultural expert in." And because of Lynn's understanding of this and her flagging that, there was a much better outcome in the end. So had Lynn not been there, probably wouldn't have been such a good outcome for the mum that she was working with. So that's another real strong story that shows the impact an interpreter can have. And yeah, if any of you watching have worked with interpreters and you've got stories similar to this, we'd love to hear them. We can share how you can get in touch with us later on. But yeah, we'd love to hear those too. I'll pass back to you, Karen.
All right. So what we've just heard from these past stories is first, there were some language differences in the case of Willie Ramirez. There was not an understanding of languages, and that led to ineffective communication. We also just heard from the Lynn story where there were cultural differences, that one party was doing things differently and others didn't understand the different culture differences, and that helped when an interpreter was present and being able to facilitate those conversations there. Now, the third thing that I'd like to talk about is low literacy level. In 2021, the Australian census indicated that approximately 44% of people would be classified as having low literacy levels. And that is around an 8th grade to a 5th grade to an 8th grade level. And what we find with people with low literacy levels is that they have very much difficulty in understanding some concepts, particularly in the legal space. When there's immense jargon, it's even hard to understand people that don't have low literacy levels, some of the things that are being said in the legal space. So in some of those cases, when easy English, that's plain English, can be presented to people with low literacy level, that goes a long way in helping to understand. So Translationz does a lot of work in this space. It's been very much in demand lately, where we have documents where we can translate into a plain English, low English level. And then oftentimes our clients require that to be translated into other languages as well. But again, interpreters are vital. We can see how important interpreters are in effective communication and helping bridge those cultural gaps and the language differences and working with people with low literacy levels. So next, we'd like to talk about the benefits of working with interpreters. And there are so many things here, as well as we had to leave off a lot of benefits in the nature of time that we have here today. I'd like to point out one where when an interpreter present, it overall, for the most part, can reduce the risk that can happen when effective communication is not being able to be conveyed. So interpreters reduces the likelihood of errors happening with the conversations because they can best explain, they can read the room, they can understand the different cultural aspects that are needed to be conveyed. And so it lessens legal risks for the person giving that kind of communication, and it lessens the risks overall for organizations. So Louise, what about you? What resonates with you with some benefits of working?
I think probably one of the key ones is the first point we've made here is the shorter hospital stays, fewer readmissions. Obviously, if you're sending this is in a health setting, obviously, but it could apply to other situations too. But if you're sending a patient away with information on here's what you could do to improve your condition that you're suffering with, for example, there's less chance of them coming back with the same or worsened condition because they've understood what you said, they followed your instructions, and their health has improved as an outcome. So I think that's a really important one, and probably saves a lot of things for our hospitals. Obviously, really important. So yeah, definitely that.
And studies have shown when interpreters are present, the patients exhibit more satisfaction,
Mm-hmm.
and increased satisfaction happens there.
Yeah.
All right, moving on.
So we'll talk now about some common mistakes that are often seen in a situation where an interpreter could definitely be a benefit. So often you'll find that people will say that they're happy to just use a family member instead of an interpreter, which in some situations could work, but often it's important to remember that a family member is not someone who's professionally trained. They may be, but most of the time they wouldn't be. So that things may get missed or omitted. It might not be appropriate sometimes for a family member to be the person delivering the information. So, for example, again, in a health setting, if there's a child and the patient is the non-English speaker and the child is having to deliver the news of a diagnosis to a parent, there could be trauma involved. It may not be an appropriate situation. So that's perhaps why family members aren't always the best option. Sometimes people will say they'll just get by. They may have a good level of English, but they may have got more out of the conversation if it was in their native language. They may have been able to express themselves better and understand you better in their native language. Also, not booking an interpreter for long enough. So if you haven't booked the interpreter for the full length of your appointment and they've got to get up and leave halfway through, obviously that's going to hinder things. Not knowing how to work with an interpreter, we're going to touch on that later in the slides. Just some hints and tricks of things you could do when you've got an interpreter in the room. And not working with a NAATI certified interpreter. So I'm not sure how many of you will be familiar with NAATI, but just to give you an idea, it's the certifying body for interpreters and translators in Australia. So what that means is for somebody to be a certified interpreter, they have to sit this certification exam, they have to recertify every 3 years, they've got to continue professional development. So that's somebody who's really, really highly trained in their field. This may be required for, say, a legal setting where it will be stated that a NAATI certified interpreter is required. So if you ever see that, that's what that means. Do bear in mind, not all languages are certified by NAATI. There's around 140 languages that are tested. And as you can imagine, all the other hundreds of languages they don't test for because there's so many languages in the world. So these interpreters would still be highly trained professionals, experienced, but they may not have this certification. So bear that in mind too, that NAATI certification doesn't apply to everyone. But those are just some common mistakes, and can lead to barriers for receiving optimal outcomes that you desire. So you may be wondering how to assess when an interpreter is required. So there's a few things you can do just to try and work this out. First thing you can do is identify if your client or patient is considered a CALD, which is culturally and linguistically diverse. So they may have a background that is other than English speaking. They may speak other languages. You can check for understanding. So you can ask them open questions. So instead of saying a question that would answer yes or no, so instead of saying, "Are you well?" you could say, "How are you feeling today?" And then gauge an idea based on how they answer that question. And how comfortable they are speaking to you in English. And then language preference, you can just say, you know, even if somebody's English level is really good, you could just say, do you have a preference for which language we carry this session out in? And they may just flag that they may not have thought that an interpreter would be an option, but it's an option that you can present to them, and might mean that you get a bit more from the appointment, from the patient or client. So we'll tell you a little bit about the different modes of interpreting. So a company such as ours would offer these 3 different modes. So you have an on-site visit. So that's obviously where interpreter comes to you, they come to the lawyer's office, the patient's home, wherever you need them to be, they'll be there. You'll all sit in the room together, usually in like a triangular formation, so you can look at each other. And that's usually the preferred option because you can read each other's nonverbal cues. You can, you know, when someone's going to go and speak. That's obviously not the most, the easiest option to get, depending on where you are, especially in Australia. It's such a big country. So this is why we offer other modes as well. So we offer a video interpreter sometimes. So you can book them. You can set up a Teams meeting or telehealth, something like that. And they would obviously just appear on the screen. You'd still be able to see each other, hand gestures, things like that. So that's often a really popular mode of interpreting too. And then finally, we offer telephone interpreting, which probably is people's last choice when they want an interpreter, but it's really accessible. So if you're in an emergency situation, you can't wait for somebody to turn up on site, you can't wait for somebody to set up a Teams meeting, you can get an interpreter on the phone within a few minutes, like an on-demand service. Your interpreter's there and they're ready to help. So those are the 3 different options and kind of the reasons why we offer those different services.
And most interesting, video is like the fastest growing mode of interpretation. So after COVID, before COVID, there wasn't many video options that were occurring, but now that continues to grow because so many benefits. You can get a lot more interpreters because Australia is a big country. They can phone in through the video. Seeing people's faces is so much better than telephone. But for the most part, being on site is definitely the most preferred option.
For sure. So we've just put together a little sort of ABC. Here's what to do before the appointment, here's what to do during, and here's what to do after. Obviously, just some loose advice to follow. So we suggest obviously book in a suitable interpreter. So you can consider the points that we discussed in the previous slides, so things such as level of certification, you know, if you require this high level. Perhaps if your client has a preference for the gender of the interpreter or their country of origin, you can ask them that, and that can help avoid any challenges, which we'll discuss later on. You want to brief the interpreter. This is a really important stage, which we'll touch on in the next slide. So just give them an idea of what to expect. And then obviously when it comes to it on the day, introduce everyone in the room, introduce yourself, the client interpreter, so everybody knows what everyone's role is and how things are going to work. So briefing the interpreter is a really important stage. Context is really important. And if you can, it's really good for you to share a little bit about the client's background, why you're here today, what the appointment's going to involve, if there might be something sensitive that's discussed, so that the interpreter could perhaps emotionally prepare themselves. Maybe if they need to do a bit of research on the topic, that's always a good idea. And it means that things can flow a little bit better because everyone knows what to expect and you can jump straight in. So you could either do this when you book in the interpreter, you can send some information with your booking request, or you can just have a chat with them before the session starts and just give them a basic background on what to expect during the session. So that's a really important stage. We have put all of this into a fact sheet, so don't feel like you've got to remember everything we're saying because we'll share that at the end.
And feel free to continue to write any questions in the box.
Send your questions in if we've missed anything's unclear. So while you're actually working with the interpreter as well, we've got some things to consider. And we've also had our lovely colleagues who aren't trained actresses, but you'll see them in a minute. You'd believe they were. They've done some role play videos, which we'll share in a second. But these are just the things to consider while you're actually working with the interpreter. So it's always a good idea to try and use straightforward language. Consider the vocabulary you're using. Try and speak in a way that's as straightforward as possible to simplify the interpretation process. Use basic concepts. Try not to use colloquialisms, idioms, things that might trip the interpreter up and make them think, oh, what are you actually saying? Try to be straightforward. Speak directly to the client. The appointment is between you and them. Interpreters are perfectly used to just almost being ignored in the setting because they're sitting and you're not looking at them. They're fine with that. You can speak in first person to your patient or client, and make sure you pause regularly. Don't speak in these long, drawn out sentences, which means the interpreter's got loads of information to remember and then things may end up being missed. As I say, they're really highly trained, but if you go into these big paragraphs, it's lots for someone to remember. And then just bear in mind that they may have questions. The interpreters, they're highly trained, they're amazing people, but they don't know everything. So they may have some questions. They may need to clarify or repeat something. So just be open to them asking you things too.
They might not hear the question. And so they'll be asking those questions. So those things happen throughout the whole sessions all the time.
Mm-hmm. So we've got videos to run now.
Right. So we'll just preference the videos. Here you'll be seeing there's the doctor present, the interpreter present, and the patient. So there's super short videos. And as Louise had said, these are staff that work with us, so they're not trained actors.
Action.
Good morning, interpreter. Can you please ask the patient if they understand why she's here today?
Sa perché oggi qui?
Sì.
Yes.
Action.
Good morning, Mrs. Rossi. Do you understand why I've brought you in today?
Buongiorno, signora Rossi. Sa perché qui oggi?
Sì.
Yes.
Action.
So, Miss Rossi, let me see what's brought you in today. Sounds like you're presenting with an acute exacerbation of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease complicated by concomitant pneumonia and secondary respiratory failure requiring non-invasive positive pressure ventilation.
Sorry, doctor, do you mind to use a more simplified terminology?
Oh, apologies for that. So you're experiencing a worsening of your chronic lung condition, which has led to pneumonia, so we'll need to give you an oxygen mask.
Sta presentando una complicazione riguardante la sua malattia cronica, polmonite, e le servirà una maschera di ossigeno per respirare meglio.
Sì, sì.
Action.
So, Mrs. Rossi, you're experiencing a sudden worsening of your chronic lung condition called COPD. This has led to pneumonia at the same time, making it harder for you to breathe. To help breathe better.
Sorry, doctor. Do you mind just to shorten your sentences so that I can interpret better for the patient?
Oh, of course, I'm so sorry about that. I do need to give you an extra time to be able to interpret.
Yes.
I feel like we need to redo that one. Okay.
Action.
So, Mrs. Rossi, it looks like you're experiencing a sudden worsening of your chronic lung condition called COPD.
Signora Rossi, sta avendo un peggioramento della sua condizione polmonare cronica.
Perfect. So this has led to pneumonia at the same time, making it harder for you to breathe.
Questo ha comportato una polmonite che le ha reso difficile la respirazione.
To help you breathe better, we will provide you with an oxygen mask.
Per aiutarla a respirare meglio, utilizzeranno una maschera d'ossigeno.
Sì, sì.
Yes.
Action.
So, Mrs. Rossi, how are you travelling today?
Signora Rossi, come ha viaggiato oggi?
In macchina?
By car?
Oh, sorry, I should probably rephrase that. So, Mrs. Rossi, how are you feeling today?
Signora Rossi, come si sente oggi?
All right. Well, sorry to jump in there too soon. We don't see it on our screen, but it was done offline. But I hope you had a chance to see the before and the better option, depicting some of those things that Louise had talked about, talking clearly to the patient, not to the interpreter, using words that don't have jargon in it and simple language. So those are some of the things that are highly recommended when you're working with interpreters. So next, we'd like to talk about some cases when direct translation from certain words in health-related, as well as medical-related and other social services, is not in that patient's language. So for example, cancer. So cancer in some languages is not fully translatable. And so what has occurred in many languages that they form new languages by compounding words. So for example, in Hindi, the word is pronounced kar rog. And what it is a compound of a couple words where the first part of it, kar means crab, and the back end, rog, means disease, and kind of replacing like what a crab might do as far as nature spreading throughout the body. So you can see those images of that kind of word being created to represent what cancer is. Another thing we'd like to talk about is the cultural differences. Throughout the presentation, we touched on that quite often, but in some cultures, discussing cancer openly might be taboo or associated with fear and a lot of superstition. So making communication about cancer, about that disease, might be quite difficult. Interpreters are there to help bridge that gap of cultural differences, helping both parties understand the differences and facilitating that conversation in a much better way. And cancer is not the only term that is non-translatable. There's so many other terms, and I can name a few here, like suicide is often related to stigma and fear and superstition, as well as domestic violence, addiction, disability, divorce, and poverty. Those are among some of the things that are really difficult in many cultures to try to explain.
Do bear in mind as well that you may sometimes find an interpreter, you've said a short sentence, and what the interpreter said here is not a translation, or fits perhaps a destination in the language. They may need to just add a bit on and speak a bit more, just so that the person that you're speaking with fully understands what is being discussed. So just bear that in mind as well, if it sounds like they're saying more than what you said.
As well as English words. Many times when people are interpreting, English words are used. So that is quite common, that there may not be a direct translation and the English word is appropriate in those cases.
Yeah, so it doesn't mean the interpreter doesn't know the word and they just used English instead.
Exactly.
It's just a common thing. Yeah.
Okay.
So as the sort of after part of before, during, after of working with an interpreter, we suggest, if time permits, I know you're probably very busy people, the interpreters are busy too, but if time does permit, if you can just have a quick debrief with the interpreter after a session has finished. So it's just a chance for you to check in with them if perhaps something sensitive was discussed, just make sure they're okay. And also if they've got any feedback for you for perhaps how you could work better with an interpreter next time, and vice versa. If you've got anything to say to them, just a little debrief at the end, so that anything that needs to be flagged could be flagged at that point and dealt with there and then. So if time permits, of course.
All right, so we want to point out some challenges, because every interpreting session is not roses and sunshine. So there are many challenges sometimes when an interpreter is present on assignments. So one thing that we wanted to point out is that many times a client may reject the interpreter. So family members may not want an interpreter present and may be very vocal and request the interpreter not to be present. Oftentimes as well, some patients and some clients may say, my English is well, I can speak well in English. and also reject the interpreter. In many of those cases, interpreters are on standby, so they'll still be present in the appointment and then just jump in on when those more challenging or more difficult words are being presented at that time. So any other things that may resonate to you with potential challenges?
So there could be possible sort of cultural issues that come up. So perhaps this is where we suggested earlier on that you could ask the person that you're working with whether they've got a preference for like cultural background or the country of origin of the interpreter. Just because in certain cultures there could be issues between certain countries, there could be conflict. So that's always something worth checking. This is why we say to sort of in advance provide as much information as possible up front, so that companies such as ours can ensure that we assign an interpreter who's the most appropriate for the situation.
An example of that, what we're facing now, is the language of Nuer and Dinka. So many people can speak both languages, but because of all the cultural strife that's happening in Ethiopia and South Sudan, many people don't want to interpret for those different countries. And so that presents difficulties at times.
And again, with possible ethical issues too, it's always worth presenting, if you can, share what the appointment will be about, because if it's a very sensitive topic that some of our interpreters may not be happy to work with, they can flag that before they accept the assignment, and then it doesn't cause an issue on the day. So yeah, that's probably our main advice, isn't it? To just, if you can, share as much information as possible about why you're booking the interpreter, and then we can assess that and book someone who's most appropriate and suited to the situation.
And any potential challenges. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Okay, so I think we can just summarize here everything that we've discussed.
Yeah, so we'll provide a top line summary here. We've talked a lot, and here's just a top line summary. So we have presented interpreting sessions to look at it in before, during, and after the session that you may have with an interpreter. So preparation before the appointment, it is so important to brief the interpreter on the client so that they can get as much information as possible so that they can come in and do a superb job when they're working on the appointment, during the appointment. Consider possible challenges and make those known beforehand. Those are important as well. Now, during the appointment, introduce all parties to each other and speak directly to the client in first person using simple English, pausing, and avoid any kind of jargon that may cause confusion. And consider some of the cultural nuances that we spoke of, but an interpreter present there, they'll do really great in helping to work on understanding the different cultures and educating both parties on that. And then following the appointment, it's super important to brief the interpreter when you have time. We all understand that in many of the appointments, it's back to back and it's so busy, but it is highly beneficial if you have the time, if you can debrief the interpreter, and they'll provide you with some really useful information that you can use for your subsequent appointments with your clients. Okay, so we're here at the Ask Questions stage. So if you'd like to open it up and ask some questions, if you've already done so, we'll have a look at some of the questions that may have come in. But again, you could be moving your mouse over those three dots and put in Ask Your Question. So Louise, do we have any questions here?
Okay, so we have a question. Somebody's asked, how does setting, this is from Joe, how does setting up a video interpreter work? So do you want me to go through that one? So that's entirely up to you, really. If you want a video interpreter, you can decide which platform you want to use. And then, for example, if you were booking with us and you were booking with Microsoft Teams, you would just provide us with the link and we'd ensure that that's shared with any the interpreter who's working. We can help, troubleshoot with links and things like that. But it comes down to you really, which you'd prefer to use, what your preferred option is.
And interpreters are highly trained on different platforms. So again, if you're using Teams or HealthShare Direct or Zoom, which is probably not recommended, or certain other platforms, interpreters, we work with our interpreters and other language service providers also, make sure that their interpreters are able to access different platforms.
Mm-hmm.
We test their internet. We make sure that they're in a good environment that is confidential as well. So those are a lot of things that go on in the background in order to make sure that video interpreting comes across smooth and seamless.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
More questions?
This is a good one from Fiona, using correct words. If words like suicide and discussing domestic violence are not appropriate to use in certain languages, what should workers do? Still use that word? So
Right. So yeah. So you always have to gauge your clients, right? We recommend that that is something that you do, and I know for sure all the people here are doing that on a daily basis. Interpreters are there, and they've seen it before, so they have been in all sorts of situations, and relying on an interpreter, explaining to them what you would like to convey to your patient, to your client, could go a long way in helping to get through that difficult conversation. You know, it's a necessity, right, to get through that conversation. But again, reading your client and working with an interpreter can help and provide getting through those difficult conversations that you may have.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is what we meant when we said about interpreters perhaps having to expand on things sometimes, and you may say something and see the interpreter take a minute to think how best to say this in the other language. So yeah, the interpreter would decide that too, and use their experience to decide how best to word it, I would say.
Right. And to add to that, interpreters are highly trained. We've talked about that before, that they have seen a lot, they have gone through a lot, and have high levels of training and ongoing professional development.
Okay, there's one from Claire. That's a good practical question. How much notice do we need to give you to get an interpreter? That's a good question. Ideally, as much notice as possible, but we understand that things crop up last minute. So we, as a company, will always try our best to get an interpreter in if it's something urgent. We have our interpreters, so we'll phone out to them. Like we said, we've got this on-demand service where you can get a phone interpreter if you need one in an emergency. Yeah, ideally, sort of, what would you say in terms of a timeline? What the ideal?
If you put a week is great, right? Bear in mind that the best interpreters get scheduled on assignments first. The highest level of interpreters are always scheduled on assignments first, but we have 35,000 interpreters that we work with. So we have a lot of interpreters that we can tap into. If you're open to different modes, if you don't need someone on site, but can take video or telephone, there's super high chances of getting an interpreter. We have like a 99% rate of fill rates when all those modes can be accessed. But again, if the sooner the better is always recommended. But of course, that doesn't happen in everyday life. Things happen. People walk into the ER and they phone us within our operators answer in 30 seconds. And then we're connected on average, these are averages, in less than a minute. So those things are pretty quick. But again, more notice and on site, if that's the preferred method, it's always great to book well in advance.
Mm-hmm. Depends on the situation.
Exactly.
So there's one here. When a client rejects the interpreter, but the professional wants the interpreter, what should the interpreter do or say?
Right. So being on standby, the interpreters have most likely have come across these kinds of situations. It does happen. It does happen in some cultures, some male-dominated cultures. We do see that quite often. So the interpreters will kind of, make their way in the corner of the room, if that's allowed. They may have to leave the room and the physician could call them in. So a lot of times people are judging how much the interpreter is required. So they'll be standing by, they'll be still there, and things may happen where the customer may want the interpreter in the end and can be accepted again into the room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's again depends on the situation. If the client really doesn't want you in the room, then you've got to decide what the best step to take there is, and what the professional feels as well. And
it is about patient comfort,
yeah.
patient safety as well. As caring individuals, we're all caring individuals, and that's what we want to do, the best for the patient, but for the people that we serve. And so it's gauging the room, gauging the customer, and seeing what's the best outcome for everyone.
Yeah. And we have one quite specific here to phone interpreting from Alma. It's difficult to explain about family genograms or family tree and complexities over the phone. Do you have any suggestions? I suppose if I'm understanding this question correctly, if you're able to, so if it's like a pre-booked, so we were saying now, if you're pre-booking your interpreter and you're able to share documents that would relate to this, perhaps. So if there's something that you could share with the interpreter beforehand so that they can see what you're referencing. If the video is an option as opposed to phone, if you can set that up and be able to sort of show that. I'm not sure if that answers that question. Do you know what to add?
If it didn't answer the question, then maybe put the question in a bit more and we can circle back to that.
Okay. So from Sharon about privacy, what steps should we take to ensure that we don't breach privacy legislation in engaging an interpreter, especially when dealing with sensitive issues? Is consent needed, and in what form?
Right. So first off, if we start out with interpreters, they have to sign and be bound by the AUSIT Code of Ethics. So they take training, they have to see videos and participate in professional development and fully understand that they must abide by the AUSIT Code of Ethics. So disclosing information to the family members, to anyone outside of those sessions is a breach of confidentiality. So this is something that day in and day out is talked to in interpreters. We do webinars inviting interpreters, reminding them of those important aspects of maintaining confidentiality. There are times when clients do send us confidentiality agreements that ask us to sign those. We are happy to sign those for the most part. We sign those. We ensure that our interpreters are bound by those confidentiality rules. Before they sign up with us as an interpreter, we gather so much data on interpreters, their police checks, their certificates, if they go to the hospital, their measles, mumps, rubella, all those things are required in order to be an interpreter. So they do also sign with us a confidentiality agreement that they will abide by these confidentiality things that are always required. But that is a very important question, and that is sometimes when there's smaller communities, right? That is something that is very much of consideration. And if an interpreter feels as though they are unable to interpret for a party because they may know that party, then they will disclose that in advance and say that I can't interpret here for this party because I have too much knowledge about the party. And then in that case, we find different interpreters for you. We place interpreters so that is not a conflict.
Mm-hmm. I think you answered everything then. Somebody has asked, Amrita, how many languages are in high demand and which are those? It's a good question. I think probably our main languages would be probably Mandarin, Arabic, Vietnamese, yeah. Auslan, yeah.
Korean, Japanese, we have Spanish. What we find, though, interesting that maybe in Townsville, for example, Kurdish Kurmanji is very much in high demand. So that's the most prominent language that is serviced in that area because the refugees have come there, and there's a huge population in Townsville, and a little bit of Arabic, but more so in central Brisbane, Arabic, Vietnamese, and Auslan. Auslan is the 4th commonly spoken language across the country and in Queensland as well. If you look at Victoria, for example, Greek is a popular language that is not so much up here in Queensland. So that's a little bit of a...
Yeah, so it depends on the area, isn't it? There's communities in different areas. So high demand in some areas, and it depends where you are. Question from Michelle. Encountering issues with interpreters, what is the best process to follow if you have concerns about the way an interpreter is working with a client? So, for example, if you think they may not be accurately conveying information to the client or giving biased representations of what the client has said. So how could you flag this?
Sure. Yeah, so again, every assignment is not perfect, right? Every time an interpreter shows up, there may be issues. And as a company, a language service company, we do want to hear that if there's any issues. So if you're working with the hospital, for example, or legal system, we work with the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. There's a feedback form that can be given and provided some information. Now, that's after the fact. But if you are concerned that an interpreter is not up to your satisfaction or to your high standards, you can stop that session and ask the interpreter to be dismissed. We could hear from you and provide an alternative, like a phone interpreting, if that person is on site. So we can do that and try not to, so that the session may continue. But those are some of the avenues that you may have. But you may want to question the interpreter and ask them some questions. And it may be where, as Louise had mentioned, sometimes there might be too much English being presented in the session, and the interpreter could explain as to why he or she may need to talk more in English. Another language, the Hmong language, has very few words, and they often refer to hand gestures. And that way of conveying things. So it may be also a cultural issue. But again, we take these matters seriously. So if there's any issues that you encounter with interpreters, do bring those up. We want feedback because that only makes things better, the interpreters better. We send them through other trainings if they need that. So those things are very important. So please don't hesitate to make your feelings known if you have some concerns.
We maybe have time for one more.
Okay.
If you're happy to. Somebody says, so Jordan, do you think it's viable to ask more abstract questions through an interpreter? For example, questions about things like values, goals, etc.
Right.
That's a very interesting question. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Well, of course, you're professionals, and if that's what is important to understand your patient or your customer, of course, asking those questions would be beneficial if that's the situation that you're in. The interpreters are highly skilled. They're super smart. They've gone through a lot of training. Many of them are university graduates. Some of them are doctors. Some of them are lawyers, dentists. So, abstract questions to me sound a little bit more difficult to answer because they're not straightforward. So there might be a little bit of a kind of work there that is required to further explain those kinds of questions to the party you'd want to explain that to.
Yeah, exactly that. They'd probably have methods that they employ when they ask these questions that perhaps aren't so straightforward, and the client's answers aren't quite so straightforward. I'd imagine our interpreters have got ways that they deal with this and ways that they process that in their heads and think of the best way to convey that. So yeah, obviously if it's a question that you need to ask, then ask away and they'll do their best to convey what you're saying. But yeah, I think we need to wrap up now.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That was so interesting.
Yes, thank you so much for all of your questions. Ones that we didn't get to, we can get back to you if you've left your details. We've got this QR code that you can scan here. should take you to our website. If you try that on your phone, so you can get our download our PDF with all the, basically summarizes everything that we've talked about today, which is handy to keep.
And best practices of working with interpreters.
Yes, exactly that. Join our mailing list if you want to stay in touch with us. You'll get our newsletters, find out what we've been up to, and the latest news in the industry.
All right, and then just one more. We would really like to thank you for spending your time here with us. The presentation will be available shortly. You'll be able to access the presentation if you'd like to see this again by clicking on the same link that was provided to you for this event. And thank you so much, Multicultural Affairs Queensland, for inviting Louise and myself to come here today and talk about some very important, what we believe is very important, and how to work with interpreters. And we'd like to make a special mention again about the wonderful events that Multicultural Affairs is doing for the Multi-Queensland month for this month. There's many webinars that you can access, and if you access the website, there's lots of other resources and things that are very, very much helpful. So feel free to reach out to us, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day, wonderful week, and is the weekend coming up soon? Almost, yeah.
Tuesday, but nearly there.
I don't get there soon enough. So. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.